So that was a great exercise there in the first half to look at ourselves through the lens of our subjectivity and our objectivity and see how we hold that, how these are appendages for the ego to navigate in this crazy thing called life. So in the second half, tonight, we are moving on to fourth evening and looking at the Western spiritual perspective of the ego. And just to do a quick reiteration of what we've looked at so far. And by the way, I want to encourage note-taking because, for one thing, I feel note-taking helps to engage the left brain to help take things in and make it more objective. And also to continue this practice of just asking questions rather than making definitive statements around what the ego is, what we think it is. We'll continue to try and phrase things as questions because I think a question creates an openness of space, which is perhaps more the right brain cognitive activity. So we began with Freud, just quickly to reiterate how he felt that behavior was largely a result of the expression or the repression of earthly desire. That our behavior really has its roots in our earthly nature. And then the second week we looked at Jung, who was really seeing something higher. That he felt that there was a higher desire that is trying to be expressed in our behavior. And it would be expressed in our nighttime dreams and in our daytime synchronicities. So behavior also had roots in something of a spiritual nature that was trying to come through. And this is one of the causes of the break with Freud because of the difference in how they saw, the background working through in our behavior. And Jung was really trying to be more open to something of a spiritual or metaphysical impulse that was working through, while trying to at the same time maintain his scientific credibility, which was really quite an interesting line that he walked, and did it quite famously to have his work. Although today it is still, some people look at it as being a little too far out in his ideas. So then last week, we went further into the spiritual perspective of the ego, looking at the Eastern spiritual perspective, and through the lens of Osho, the Eastern spiritual teacher. And I called that session the Osho No-Go Ego. And we looked at something of a dissertation or a dialogue he had with a group of people. One of his students was asking, he was feeling torn between the teachings of Rudolf Steiner that he had been raised with and the things that Osho was teaching, and he was having a hard time reconciling these two sides. And Osho had talked about how Steiner was considered one of the greatest minds of the century, but a mind, being great or small, is really just a mind and has nothing to do with spiritual practice or religious work. So he said that this Western way of thinking that Steiner was famous for was good for scientific knowing and scientific invention, but was really, there's really a gap between it and the Eastern meditation and Eastern perspective that Osho was teaching, which he said really required no mind, that you have to drop the mind and drop your thinking, drop your ideas, because when you have that, the ego becomes invested in your ideas, you become attached to them, and the only recourse really is to connect and merge with the original mind, that you have to seek no mind so that you can connect to the original mind. Otherwise, this life of thought produces tension and just builds ego and egotism. But when you go the path that he purports, then the ego disappears. That you get rid of the ego, and when you get rid of the ego, what's there? Well, nothing. He said nothing is found when you get rid of the ego, and that for him is really the objective. Is that you actually get rid of the ego, you destroy yourself so that you no longer exist. And there'll be no more tension, there'll be no more stress in your life, because you're no longer thinking ego being. And he also said that Rudolf Steiner really didn't know what meditation was, that what Rudolf Steiner taught was forms of concentration, and that what Osho was teaching was to not concentrate, but really just to learn to go into expanded states of consciousness where there is no concentration, and then there is also actually no distinction or separateness between yourself and the other. There'd be no distinction between the dog barking, the bird chirping, the sound of the wind, because it's all really just one message, which he said is God. So I kind of just have to point out that doesn't necessarily line up what he's saying about, Eastern meditation is not ever concentration, because there are many different Eastern practices that involve concentrating on a flame. The Tatrika exercise to focus on a flame, or a mandala, or the repetition of a sound, is to focus on something to the exclusion of other things. And also that there are some meditations that are more passive, where you let go, you expand, and you try to find that place of the void, of nothingness. But then there are also forms of meditation that are active, that you engage with something and you engage yourself with that something. And Rudolf Steiner, he knew a lot of what he was talking about. I mean, here's a book called Start Now, which is a collection of different practices. It says a book of soul and spiritual exercises, and it's kind of an overview of, or cross-section of the many different types of practices that he taught over his life. There's also another book here, quite a fat compendium, collection called Soul Exercises, Word and Symbol Meditations, that he gave between 1904 and 1924. So Rudolf Steiner was working with hundreds of different exercises to target the different parts of our complex being. And I just want to say that there's always a danger to oversimplify things when talking about things on the spiritual path, to make them too black and white, to try and boil them down to simple little concepts. And we fall into the danger of what I call pseudo-Buddha babble, where things sound good and simple, when in reality things aren't really as simple as they may seem. And this often happens in New Ageisms as well, where things get oversimplified. So I know some of you that I've talked to felt in accord with what Osho taught, and that's fine. You're going to have your say next week. Right now we've been looking at Freud, Jung, Osho, and then tonight Rudolf Steiner. But next week you're going to have your say on what you feel about the nature of the ego. I want to give another couple of quotes from Osho, just to show the larger context of the model, the idea that he's bringing forth in his teachings as a Eastern spiritual teacher. He says, "Knowledge is nothing but lies you have collected from others. Unless something is of your own experience, it is a lie. Truth has to be your own experience. Well, is that really true? Because that certainly, is throwing it completely into the subjective side of things. That your experience, your subjective experience, is the truth. Well, it may be your truth, but is it the objective truth? And this is the point of, the scientific methodology, is to not just base the idea of truth on our experience, but more on objective facts. Otherwise, our experience can be completely delusional and erroneous, leading us to, false conclusions. So, another thing he said, because at age 20 he claimed that he was enlightened. He said, "The day I became enlightened, I realized that there is nothing to achieve. There is nowhere to go. There is nothing to be done. We are already divine, and we are already perfect as we are. No improvement is needed. No improvement at all. God never creates anybody imperfect." Well, okay, a couple of points here.
This Steiner?
No, this is Osho still.
Okay, go.
Yeah. I haven't got the Steiner yet. The first thing, he's equating enlightenment with realizing nothing has to be done. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to achieve. Well, I can appreciate, the need to just be, but are we really trying to teach ourselves that there's nothing to achieve? That there's nothing to be done, nowhere to go? Furthermore, he says, the absurdity of seeking enlightenment when it is already our intrinsic nature and not something to be achieved, but something we inherently possess. The ultimate truth is we are born enlightened, and realizing it is simply recognizing what has always been. And furthermore, he says that his role as a guru was to simply awaken us to this fact and remind us of the fact that we're already enlightened, we were born that way, and we're already perfect. There's nothing to improve upon because God doesn't make anything that's imperfect. Well, are we perfect and already enlightened and there's nothing to work at? I think that kind of cuts at the whole thing about the work that the masters have done over the ages to achieve enlightenment. That it took tremendous effort at times. It took discipline, sacrifice, study, service. So I'm a little concerned with some of these statements and the oversimplification, or we could call it new age washing, of these ideas around already being enlightened, already being perfect, and there's nothing to do. It kind of derails the whole concept that we'll look at with Steiner about the evolution of consciousness. That there is a spiritual evolution taking place. We've all obviously already evolved to quite a high degree as human beings, but there's certainly also obvious a lot more work to be done in our evolution. And this is not just necessarily evolving our bodies, but to evolve our consciousness. And to present ideas that there's nothing to be done except to just be, kind of derails this whole idea of now us carrying forward our own evolution. And it's not only Osho that, I'm kind of picking on Osho because he picked the fight with Steiner. But, this is really coming out of the Eastern spiritual perspective, and we'll look at why a little more closely in a moment. But here's another one from Paramahansa Yogananda, who started the Self-Realization Fellowship, and he wrote the book Autobiography of a Yogi. He says, "Man is important in one sense only. He was made in the image of God. That is his importance. He is not important in his body, ego, or personality. His constant affirmation of ego consciousness is the source of all his problems. And then also there's a series on the Gaia Network about Ram Dass, who was a Harvard professor and then went to India and took up Eastern practices and wrote the famous book Be Here Now. This Gaia Network series is called Becoming Nobody. Becoming Nobody. So this is, some of the ancient Eastern perspective about the dissolution of the ego, becoming nobody, that ego consciousness is the source of all problems. But I want to put this question forth, just hold it as a question. If the ego is the source of problems to ourselves and to the planet, could it possibly also be the source of solutions going forward? We've seen what a problem it's been in the past. Could it be the source of solutions going forward? Just a question. And does becoming nobody solve any problems? Or does that really revert back to more of a tribalistic way of identifying ourselves? And what does that even mean, to be nobody? And do you feel confused by this type of teaching as a modern Western person? So I want to focus on the ideas. I think the ideas are important, but I also want to take a moment to point out something of the shadow side of Osho, who was born and raised in India, and then he fled India to avoid criminal charges around immigration issues and tax evasion and smuggling of gold, and came to the U.S. and bought 180,000 acres of land in Oregon, where he transplanted his commune and his community. But over a short period there of, 4 or 5 years, ended up being involved in bioterrorism to poison people and living in the community around there, even drugging some of his own disciples to unknowingly to sedate them. There was a plan to assassinate a government official so they could win an election in the town. He was apparently addicted to drugs, Valium, and also set up tanks of nitrous oxide in his place so he could have nitrous oxide infusions daily. So there was a lot of criminal activity that he deflected, and some of his personal assistants ended up going to prison for several years. So a controversial figure. I just wanted to bring that in. In some ways considered quite extravagant. He had over 90 luxury cars. He had $1 million watch. He was known as the sex guru because he was very liberal. He encouraged his people to, rather than think about sex, just have sex, which he apparently did as well. If you want to know more about him, as I did, I watched the 6-part Netflix documentary last week called The Wild Wild Country. It was quite disturbing to watch, and you'll see there's opinions on both sides. Some people consider him corrupt, manipulative, womanizing, megalomaniac, even evil, whereas there's others that are continuing to keep his legacy alive and publish his books and promote videos and things like that. You have to think for yourself and make up your own mind as to what your feeling is around this. But my question is his teachings good for the future? By the way, he eventually was extradited to India and then died about 4 years later in 1990 at the age of 59. So all that aside, really the questions are around his ideas that are being promoted even to this day, which is, granted, it's a mixture of things that are true, things that sound true, but then potentially things that are not necessarily supportive of modern spirituality. Is his teachings actually preaching an outdated path? This is the question that I want to bring up. Because in my life's work, my question has been to understand the difference between Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. Because obviously, we have access to both. Since the 1960s, there's been a real circulation of Eastern ideas in the Western world. A lot of people have gone to India, myself included. I went there, spent several months there, and stayed at different ashrams with different gurus to understand, what was going on. I've also been interested in the difference between the older teachings and the newer teachings, because my work as a teacher, I'm concerned about what is going to support the modern mind, people that are raised in the scientific mindset that tend to have more left brain development, skepticism towards spirituality and whatnot. What is going to support them in a conscious spiritual life? And this is why I've had an interest in the work of Rudolf Steiner, who developed a body of work over his lifetime, which he calls anthroposophy. Anthroposophy really means the wisdom of the human being. And he came up through the Theosophical Society for a time before breaking away. But the Theosophical Society still exists today, and they have headquarters in India, because it was started by a woman named Madame Helena Blavatsky, a Russian woman, who went to India to gather up Eastern knowledge and to bring it to the West, to bring it to the Western world, to bring it to the European world, and even brought it to America with the headquarters in New York. So in the work of Theosophy and also Anthroposophy, there's a lot of Eastern wisdom. There's a lot of Eastern teaching. They teach about karma and reincarnation. They talk about the subtle bodies and the chakras, to connection to higher planes of existence beyond the physical plane. So this is what I'm going to bring forth tonight, is some of the Western spiritual perspective from the other corner. We've had Osho in one corner, and the other corner we're going to have Rudolf Steiner, who's not here to defend himself, but he did write 35 books and gave over 6,000 lectures that got written down. And I've spent much of my life studying his works, so that's what I'm going to unpack a little bit right now. But even before that, of course, I had to test this out by first asking ChatGPT. So I did. I said, did Rudolf Steiner have to say anything about the ego? What did he say about the ego? So I'm going to read you a little bit of what ChatGPT had to say. And I was actually kind of surprised and delighted. It did the work for me. Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, had a profound understanding of the ego, or I, and saw it as a central component of human spiritual development. In Steiner's view, the ego represents the individual's core identity and the unique spiritual self. Unlike the physical body, or the life forces, the etheric body, or the emotions and desires, the astral body, the ego is the part of the human being that is truly individualized and self-aware. The ego is the most advanced conscious aspect, and is what allows humans to develop self-awareness and individuality, unlike animals, which do not have a fully individualized ego. Steiner viewed the development of the ego as a progressive journey. He believed that humans are evolving toward higher levels of self-awareness and spiritual insight, and that the ego plays a crucial role in this process. According to Steiner, the ultimate goal of spiritual evolution is for the ego to fully transform and refine the lower aspects of the self, the physical body, the life forces, and the emotions, into a harmonized, spiritualized form. Steiner believed that the ego has the potential to develop beyond ordinary self-awareness. By engaging in spiritual practices, meditation, and self-discipline, an individual can cultivate a higher consciousness. In Steiner's view, the ego's role is both a gift and a responsibility. It's the source of individuality and freedom, yet also of selfish desires and isolation. He saw the spiritual journey as one in which the ego learns to transcend its lower impulses, integrate into the greater spiritual whole, and ultimately become a vessel for universal love and wisdom. Thank you, ChatGPT. I don't think I could have said it better myself. The world is really changing, isn't it? Now, the interesting thing, with Osho in one corner and Rudolf Steiner in the other corner, is that they both had PhDs in Western philosophy.
Osho too?
Yes, Rudolf Steiner got a PhD in philosophy in Germany, and Osho got his in India. Yet, they're diametrically opposed in certain regards. Now, I think they're both on the same page in that the objective and aim was to have direct experience of spiritual reality. To have direct experience of spiritual reality, but coming at it in different ways. They weren't wanting to stop just at theoretical philosophical concepts. So even though they both had PhDs in Western philosophy, that was not sufficient. And to just elucidate that a little bit, I've got one of Steiner's first books. This was a second version of it. The first version was called The Philosophy of Freedom. It was one of his seminal works, The Philosophy of Freedom, where he gives an overview of the history of philosophy, Western philosophy, bringing people up to date with that. He then republished the book as The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity. So he changed the title from The Philosophy of Freedom to Philosophy Activity to show that to be a free being required spiritual activity, not just thinking about freedom, not just thinking about philosophy, not just being a mental plain armchair philosopher, but that it needed to go beyond the level that the great philosophical thinkers of Greece and of the Middle Ages arrived at, Kant and Immanuel Kant and Descartes and so forth, that needed spiritual activity. And then a third version of the book came out about 15 years ago. At the top it's called The Philosophy of Freedom, Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path. Intuitive thinking as a spiritual path. So he's really pushed where the philosophers kind of stopped and stalled at, to say that the next step in thinking is to develop higher capacities of thinking that involve intuition, and he also uses the word imagination with a capital I, that we have to develop the imagination as a spiritual capacity, and also inspiration with a capital I as a spiritual capacity. So intuition, imagination, and inspiration. One is actually spiritual seeing, the other is spiritual hearing, and the other is spiritual knowing. And a third book I've got of his here called The Redemption of Thinking. The Redemption of Thinking. So he recognizes that thinking alone is not going to do it. Thinking alone is not a spiritual activity. But in the redemption of thinking, thinking can be a spiritual activity. That actually can be, contrary to what Osho said about get rid of your thinking, unlearn your thinking, it's all a bunch of lies anyways. Steiner in the other corner is saying, no, that is the way of the future spiritually for people of a modern mindset. And I'll just read a little bit from the introduction here, which is not him, but somebody else wrote the introduction, saying that these lectures were given as part of Rudolf Steiner's lifelong endeavor to awaken an understanding of the true relation between spirit and matter in the human, in opposition to scientific materialism and to the separation of the spheres of faith and reason. This understanding of the spiritual world Rudolf Steiner expressed in what he called spiritual science, a scientific approach to the realities that lie beyond the range of sense perception. In these lectures, he relates spiritual science to the philosophical approach to spiritual reality and the problems of human thinking. So he's on the same page as Osho and recognizing the problems of human thinking and the limitations of human thinking, and how thinking can be misleading. It can lead us down the wrong path, or it can lead us nowhere at all. And how often thinking really gets trapped in that scientific materialism. And we see what a problem that is in the world today. Further on in the introduction, he's quoting the scientist named James Jeans, who points out the illusory nature of the findings of physics. Quoting James, "We can never understand what events are, but must limit ourselves to describing the patterns of events in mathematical terms. These will never describe nature itself, but only our observations on nature. Our studies can never put us into contact with reality. We can never penetrate beyond the impressions that reality implants in our minds." So a rather pessimistic view about the capacities of the human being, to be able to connect, have a direct experience with reality. And that at best we can only quantify it mathematically, but we can never really penetrate into the reality that's beyond the mathematics and the quantifiable nature. But then there's a counter side here, quoting someone else, Dr. Maurice Nicoll, who says, "Is the sole method of experiencing or understanding life by way of the method of science? Is not science merely one mode of experience? Are not further states of consciousness most likely to be the key to understanding of the complexities and contradictions that have arisen in the realm of physics?" 70 years ago, Rudolf Steiner then a young university student at Vienna, had come to the same conclusion. He had been studying Schiller's letters concerning the aesthetic education of man, and in his autobiography, The Story of My Life, Steiner writes, Schiller spoke of the state of consciousness which must be present in order that we may experience the beauty of the world. Might one not also think of a state of consciousness which could mediate to us the truth in the being of things? If this is granted, then one must not, after the fashion of Immanuel Kant, observe the present state of human consciousness and investigate whether this can enter into the true being of things. One must first seek to discover the state of consciousness through which man places himself in such a relation to the world that things and facts reveal their being to him. And I believe that I knew of such a state of consciousness. It was in concentrated meditation on pure thought, which is not immediately derived from sense experience, that Steiner saw the first steps towards the attainment of a higher level of consciousness. So Steiner's saying that he believed he was on the path to discovering a new state of consciousness that would allow you to come into a direct experience with spiritual realities. That it wasn't through the scientific method of, quantifying mathematically everything. That has its limitations. And thinking about it, as with Immanuel Kant, that has its limitations. But there is a new, not ancient, but a new state of consciousness that can be cultivated and attained that allows for direct experience of spiritual realities. And I'll just point out one last book by Steiner's, which I use quite a lot in the spiritual boot camp training, called How to Know Higher Worlds. How. It's a how-to book. And at the top it says a modern path of initiation. So in the work of Rudolf Steiner, he's not bringing back the ancient practices of the earliest times, the Vedic teachings and so forth, but rather as a how-to book to develop something that is suitable for the modern human being. When we talk about a modern path of initiation, that what Steiner's putting forth is not even necessarily just for the modern mind, but if we go back to Jung's model of the primitive mindset, the ancient mindset, the modern mindset, and then the contemporary mindset. Contemporary doesn't really describe it for me. What I want to call it is the newly emerging hybridized human mind. The newly emerging hybridized human mind, because we're working with something that's hybridized out of two. Out of two is born a third. And what is the two? We're talking about the right brain activity that was predominant in the primitive human being, that started to shift towards the left in the ancient human being, then came really more fully over to the left in the modern, with our modern objective ego-based way of being. So with the hybridized cognitive capacities, we're now having something that is blending the left and the right together, as well as the objective and the subjective, and the scientific and the shamanistic, or what I'd like to call the neo-shamanistic. Neo-shamanistic means the new shamanistic, because we can't really return to the old shamanistic ways, because our mind isn't like that anymore. The ancient shamanistic, or really the primitive shamanistic mind, did not have so much of an ego presence to it. So there wasn't the ego activity involved in the shamanistic mindset. But now in the neo-shamanistic mindset, there is ego activity. There is also the left brain scientific thinking. So it needs to be scientific thinking blended with neo-shamanistic capacities, where we don't dissolve the ego, but we do it as a present ego, present to what's going on in the spiritual reality around us. And we'll look more at this when we get to the end of this class. We'll talk about neo-shamanism and ego death and the influence of psychedelic substances in our system, and how that works, what's going on there. I have the slideshow that I posted the link on the Google Docs, so you can go and look at that, because I've laid out the points made by Osho. I've made points by Steiner, and also what this hybridized mindset looks like. I want to look at why Osho is so diametrically different from Steiner. Regarding the ego and kind of denouncing the place of the ego in the Eastern spiritual perspective. First of all, I don't think that the word ego was used, or the concept was even there in ancient times, that they weren't speaking of the place of the ego, because the ego was not really so much of a thing. It has to do with, I think, the word ego has been co-opted by more modern Eastern spiritual teachings to point to this thing that can be problematic in our spiritual development. But one of the reasons Osho is so different is because he is coming out of the ancient perspective of things, that, for one, they looked at activity as problematic because it created karma. The word karma literally means action. So the emphasis was on non-action. Karma means action. So the need to meditate and to not be active meant that you didn't create karma, and then you were more likely to escape the wheel of karma and reincarnation. So that's some of where Osho is coming from when he says, just be. Just drop it off. Drop it all. There's nothing to achieve. There's nowhere to go. Just be nobody. And be. And that was appropriate back in the primitive and ancient times. Also appropriate because of the nature of the relationship between guru and the student. That was a very particular type of relationship back in the past, where the guru, generally older, more developed, done more practices, more connected spiritually, would actually pour the essence, the spiritual essence that they had developed, they would pour it through themselves into the disciple. This is why the disciple, even today, they focus on pictures of their guru, because the disciple identifies themselves with the guru. That's their ego identification, is actually the guru who is more connected to them, pours the divine essence through them. The disciple touches the feet of the guru to receive the infusion, to receive the Shaktipat from the guru, so they would focus their mind on the guru rather than their own ego nature. That's how they opened themselves up to divine. It had to go through the medium of the guru. So in a sense you could say that the guru was the superego over the ego of the disciple. And the disciple had to 100% surrender their will to the guru. That's the classic guru-disciple relationship. Yeah, that there was this superego relationship. But now, we don't need to go through an intermediary, and we don't need to just have faith, take it on faith. The guru tells you something, or the preacher tells you something, the minister tells you something, you take it on faith. Now it's about cultivating ourselves to have direct experience through the ego. Through the ego. The ego is now the portal to higher dimensions. This is what ChatGPT laid out quite eloquently. And so I've been using this term about being now a self-stylized evolutionary fashionista. It's about developing our uniqueness. It's about individuating. It's about developing the ego as a unique entity so it can have direct connection. So we need to be self-stylized. We need to take up our own evolution. And if you add the word loving in there, loving fashionista, that actually makes the acronym SELF, self-stylized evolutionary loving fashionista, that can do the work on its own through spiritual science rather than faith.
Yeah.
Spiritual science is work. It's not going to happen on its own anymore because we have to evolve ourselves. And it means having the courage to come out from the tribe. I mean, you look at people that are connected to the ancient mindset. They're still reading, studying, practicing the ancient teachings that were appropriate for the ancient times. And there isn't this sense of individuality. There isn't this sense of unique self-expression. They all wear the same cloaks. They all dress this way, or you're with this group, you dress this way. When you're with Osho, you all had to wear red. Everybody wore red. They're in the Oregon commune. Everybody's wearing red, because it's not about self-expression. It's about all being in a collectivism and a group soul that surrenders its will to a superego, which was the guru, Osho. So now to be a self-stylized evolutionary loving fashionista, or a self, you can dress the way you want. You can be what you want. You can grow the way you want. You don't have to follow any kind of other doctrine or dogma, but learn to follow your own cosmic GPS, because you've individuated and you have your own personal connection that's going to guide you on a unique path, that's going to bring you to the right karmic connections at the right synchronistic moments and so forth. It becomes so exciting when you break beyond the ceiling and the ceiling that these older teachings put. And I just want to say that, as I start to wind this down, that two of the biggest dangers on the earth right now is, first of all, the Western scientific materialism. That puts a ceiling on our minds when we say there's nothing beyond what you can see and what the five senses can experience. That's it. That's basically what we teach our kids. That's how we indoctrinate our people and so forth, that scientific materialism is a danger. And the second one is perpetuating outdated spiritual teachings that were appropriate in the past, and we still teach them because they sound good, they sound spiritual, but they don't address the developmental needs of a modern, individuating spiritual entity, you and me. That is a danger, and there's still a lot of that in the world, because people will say, "Oh, well, these are the original teachings of India, these classic teachings. Truth is immutable; it doesn't change. So just stick with that." Wrong. We are, as Steiner points out, there is a spiritual evolution taking place, and that is the evolution of consciousness, and the needs to support that evolution of consciousness are changing as we evolve. And so, the ideas that we hold in our mind are changing, and we have to be awake to that. We don't need to be awakened by some guru who's saying, "You're just fine the way you are, you were born enlightened, God doesn't make anything that's imperfect, so you're fine the way you are. Just stay like that and be." That sounds kind of dangerous to me. And I think there is danger, and this brings us to the conclusion where we talk about the nature of evil. And Steiner talks about how evil is really the right thing in the wrong place. Something that's misplaced, it's out of place, can be the source of evil in the world, in a person, and so on and so forth. So we've come to our conclusion here, and I want to lay out the home play for the week, which is not an Osho-style meditation, but the Vipassana meditation, which actually came later. Vipassana is a Buddhist meditation that came later than the ancient Indian, Hindu, and Vedic teachings, because Vipassana in the Buddhist was a step forward. What Buddha brought was a step forward in the preparation for modern spiritual development. So continue with the Vipassana meditation. And as you'll notice with the Vipassana, it's not about just letting the mind go, expand, and into kind of a dreamy trance state where there's no tension. But it is about being with the tension that's there in the body, in the mind, acknowledging it, and strengthening what? The witness consciousness, the observer, which is really an aspect of the ego, of the self, to be self-aware. So Vipassana is good as a preparatory step in your spiritual development. But to add to that, after you do, 5 minutes of Vipassana, 5-10 minutes, then you're going to do a Steiner exercise. One of the first exercises he gave that said, this is something everybody should be doing, regardless of whatever else you're doing. And this is a concentration exercise. It is really to bring will into thinking. To bring will into thinking. So it seems completely opposite to what Osho is teaching, but it does have great benefits for strengthening the mind, strengthening the ego in the right kind of way. So with this exercise, after you do a few minutes of Vipassana, you take an object, it could be any object, pen, paper clip, clothes peg, glass, and you are going to generate thoughts around this object for a minute or 2 minutes. Well, you can increase it as you go because it's, developing a muscle within yourself. So it's not just concentrating and fixing your mind on it, but actually thinking thoughts about it. So I'll demonstrate it. Okay, in my hand I have something that's red. It's straight. It comes to a point. We call this a pen in English. It has writing on the side. I can feel roughness with the writing. The rest of it is smooth. It's somewhat transparent, and I can see inside this dark line. There's a tube inside. The tube holds the ink. I hold it in my hand this way. I can write on paper. I wonder where this was made. How much did I pay for this? So you see, I'm generating thoughts. I'm not just staring at it. I'm not just fixing my mind on it like the candle exercise where you just stare at a candle. I'm actually bringing will into my thinking. And this is to help overcome some of the dangers in our modern times where people aren't thinking for themselves. They're letting other people think for them, or they're being told what to think, which is putting us at the precipice of another dark ages. If we don't take up the freedom to think for ourselves, to generate our own thoughts, to shape, to sculpt our own thoughts. So you do this for a minute, you can increase the time, you can do the same object the next day. I know people that have done this for years on just a chopstick. And the mind will rebel. It'll go, this is so boring, I don't want to look at this chopstick again. You're really going to have to bring will into your thinking. It's going to strengthen the will and your thinking capacity. So you're going to work with the Steiner exercise.